I recently moved and with me my entire huge yarn stash. I mean, it's not actually such a big yarn stash, but it feels big to me. I showed it in a recent video and it's basically one double besta shelf from IKEA, like not the tall ones, just kind of a small one. I'll put a video here full of yarn that I have. But like sorting through all of it when moving and thinking about when I bought what and why made me reflect a bit on my yarn buying habits. And it made me think about if it's actually bad to have a yarn stash or not. I know it's quite a controversial subject in the knitting community, so I thought I would make a video about it with my thoughts a little bit. And as always, that's just what I'm thinking. Like, you don't have to agree with me at all. You can have a completely different opinion. But I needed to kind of sort it out for myself a little bit, to think about how I want to deal with yarn in the future. And so I took a few notes and I thought maybe someone will be interested or it will be helpful for someone. So without further ado, let's talk about the pros and cons of a yarn stash, especially a biggish yarn stash. First of all, let's talk about why people have a big yarn stash. And I listed a few reasons for why I have one. If you have other ones, then please comment below because I'm really curious. But for me, essentially, what I like about my yarn stash is that it's a bit like a library. So it kind of feels like someone else described it as painting and those are your crayons. So you have this yarn in your stash, you can just kind of go there, pick something from your stash and make stuff without having to buy something and wait. I think this is a bit of a habit I got into during the beginning of COVID, when it wasn't fully clear if you'd be able to go to a yarn store to buy some yarn and stuff like that. I started kind of, not hoarding, but when I was ordering from small businesses, buying 1 or 2 skeins extra just so that I knew I would be fine. So that was definitely part of it for me, and it created this cute little library that to me feels quite wholesome in a way. My cat is mowing. I hope you don't hear him. You might. Let's see. But I'll keep going for now and let's hope he quiets down a bit. A second reason for me is I like to use my yarn as souvenirs. So I don't usually buy souvenirs when I go traveling. I might buy a postcard or 2, but that's about it. I don't really like most souvenir stuff like mugs or like, even like, I love snow globes, but I don't like travel snow globes that much, for example. So I'm not the most touristy kind of person, but I do love bringing back some yarn from when I go traveling because it reminds me of that place without being really like in the face touristy. Can you hear him? He's kind of going nuts. Yeah, I like bringing back yarn because it's not like offensively touristy to me, but reminds me of that place, and a lot of the time I can get fibers that I can't easily get here in Germany. So that kind of lends itself to starting to collect a bit more, because obviously I maybe not fully know what I'm gonna make with something when I buy it then, because I'm just traveling and looking around, so I buy a bit more. Like, these are some souvenir yarns of mine back here, and I brought them back from Scotland and I love them and they make me smile whenever I see them. I don't fully know what I'm gonna make with this yet. It's 30 grams of hand spun, but isn't it just really pretty? And I just much prefer that too. That and books. Those are my souvenir vices, I have to say. So that's the second reason. The third is I will sometimes overbuy with future projects in mind. It's not so much that I think that I need more yarn than I do for a project, but it's mostly that I think I can do more projects in a given time frame than I can. And then I have stuff for like 3 sweaters for winter, and then I managed to make 1. This year was especially bad for that. Well, technically the end of last year, because I bought a bunch of yarn and then I didn't make stuff with it. But this year I've been really good. I think I've bought 2 skeins or something like that, or 3, and that was about it. This is one of them. Got this last weekend when I went on a city trip. Isn't that really pretty as well. But yeah, that's mostly it. So I overbuy because I think I knit faster than I do, and I just do not. Then sometimes I buy more yarn than I need because it's cheaper, because there's a sale, or because there's a reduction if you buy a certain amount. So that's also something where I then end up with much or with too much. And that can be a good thing as well. Like if you're trying to knit on a budget, then it can sometimes be better to do a few big shops instead of a lot of small ones. So those are all of the things I love about my yarn stash, just that kind of emotional representation of joy for traveling, knitting, making stuff for loved ones. I think of my loved ones when I buy yarn because a lot of the time I have a specific project in mind. So that are all things that I love about that. Let's go over to the other side. And I can tell you about that because I am just coming out of a massive knitting slump. And then I moved with all of my yarn. So for me, the bad sides of a big yarn stash are that it can just make you feel bad. When I really didn't want to knit, it made me feel worse to see at all of that, like to look at all of that yarn and to think that maybe I wouldn't want to knit again for a long time, and I was wasting all of that like money on yarn, and those were all like resources that I wasn't using. Other people might have made something with it. I wasn't. I was just feeling guilty. So that made me feel worse, and it made my knitting slump worse because I did not feel that kind of like joyful creativity of looking at one skein and being like, oh, what can I make with this? But I felt guilt, and that's not a good feeling for creativity, as you probably know. Secondly, I felt, and I mean it is just true, that it was wasteful, and I was hurting the environment by having bought that much yarn that I now was not using at the moment. Well, you know that yarn uses quite a lot of resources to produce, no matter if it's acrylic, which has a double ecological footprint, because it's not only costing resources to make, but it also pollutes the environment when you wash it through microplastics. But it's also true for like basically all natural yarns. They all take a lot of water to produce, especially things like silk. But also if you buy yarn where the wool is from the other end of the world, that has to be shipped somehow, and it costs quite a lot of resources. There are some of us who have like 2 sheep in the backyard and hand spin their fur, their yarn, their wool. Oh God, I don't know what is with my words today. It is really warm in Germany. I think that's part of it. But how many of us are there like that do it like that? 2, 3, 20? Not many. Most of us buy yarn from yarn producers, and it is just a resource, and a resource takes water and energy to produce. So if you have a lot of it and you're not using it, you're hoarding resources, and it's bad for the environment. And that made me feel quite guilty because, yeah, it's not a whole room of yarn, but it is quite a lot. So what was I really doing with it? I found myself looking up stash buster projects, and then I felt like that was really stupid, because how am I looking at projects that use a bigger amount of yarn on purpose just to get rid of my yarn, instead of making something that I felt really happy about? So I didn't make any of that in the end, but the amount of stash buster projects on Ravelry kind of show you how much guilt people attach to having that much yarn, and then they will make a blanket that takes 5,000 meters in the end just to get rid of it, holding it like 4 times double or something like that. So I'm not the only one who feels like that about this. Then I was also thinking, this is a very macabre thought, and it's also a little bit, hopefully a little bit far-fetched, but I was thinking I was slowly veering into sable territory, like stash acquisition beyond life expectancy. And I don't know if you've heard that before, but it's basically when you have more yarn than you can ever knit up in your life. And I'm not there. I think I can probably use up this stash in like 4 years if I was properly like pushing, but, and I hope I have a bit more time than that, but I knew that if I keep going like this for the next 10 years and just buying a bit more than I use up every year, then I would get there in the end. And I was just thinking about how bad it would feel to kind of, I mean, probably I wouldn't be thinking about it, to be honest, but how bad it would feel to leave all of that behind for someone to deal with when I ever go. So I was thinking that then on top of already mourning, I like to think, then people would have to deal with the fact that I'm leaving all of these craft supplies behind, all of this hobby stuff. They would probably not want to throw it away because that would feel bad to them. So they would have to sort that out for me, and it would be a massive amount of work for someone who doesn't really know that much about yarn. And I just don't want that to happen. It made me feel sad to think about that, because I know I couldn't throw away my husband's hobby stuff if something ever were to happen to him, and I would just be kind of dragging it around with me. But he's very disciplined and he actually doesn't have that much. And then there is me, who's just buying skein after skein of yarn, and I just didn't want him to have to deal with all of that if something ever would happen to me. So let's change topics, because that's just sad to think about. But yeah, then there was also the thing that I realized since I started knitting, my taste in yarn changed massively. And I realized that when I sorted my stash when I moved, and it made me kind of mad with myself, because I had bought quite a bit of yarn that I wasn't using now. Specifically the alpaca yarn from Drops, for example. That's something that I used to use quite a lot, but I now find it sheds a little bit too much. I still think it's a nice yarn, but I already have cats who bestow a huge amount of hair on me, and my favorite color of clothing is black. So I'm already dealing with a lot of shedding, and I don't need extra alpaca hairy yarn on top of that. So I found I had a huge amount of that, and I was thinking, okay, well, I just bought that to kind of stash it, but now I don't actually need that anymore, and it's just wasted. I wasted that money. It's been lying around for years without me using it. That was just unnecessary. Would have been better to just see how my tastes change over time, and then buy depending on that. I also tend to buy a huge amount of fingering weight skeins that just about are enough for a very small shawl, and I already have a lot of shawls. Don't know how many I want. I mean, I love them, so I could always have more, but I end up with a huge amount of shawl skeins, some in yarn kind of qualities that I don't really like that much anymore. And it feels like a waste of money, time, resources, everything. And then there's the big one, which someone asked me about recently, and I can say fortunately I have been lucky on that front, knocking on wood. Parasites. If you have a huge yarn stash, you're making yourself quite vulnerable to moths or carpet beetles, anything like that. And that would be such a shame if you've invested that much money into your collection and then you have to deal with that, and you have to probably throw a lot of it away, freeze it, whatever. I hope that kind of eludes me. I've put a huge amount of soap in my yarn stash. Everyone who gives me soap, it ends up there. It doesn't really get used for hand washing, I'm sorry, but it does have a good purpose. My stash smells very nice, but very unappealing to moths, and so far that's worked, and I hope it will keep working. But yeah, that's another reason to not have a big yarn stash, because you might just end up having part of it eaten away. Then when I was doing all of that sorting, packing and things like that, I was kind of arguing with myself about my stash and like thinking about it a lot. I also thought, why do we actually care that much what other people do with their yarn, what we do with our yarn? Why are we caring so much about if it's wasteful or not? And I think a lot of it is kind of rooted in sexism and seeing women's hobbies as less important, because I don't know, like I was feeling guilty about having that yarn, and then I thought, wait a minute, like if you think about how many hobbies are literally collecting things, just anything really, and like miniatures, books, and people don't see that as wasteful, like having 50,000 books of which you will never read all of them. That's wasteful as well. Collecting a ton of bobbleheads that then you stash away in the cellar where you never look at them. That's wasteful. Traveling is really wasteful. I have friends who care a lot about the environment, and they really put a lot of effort into being environmentally friendly, but they'll go on a super long distance international trip at least twice a year. And to be honest, I feel like people should have their joy. And as long as you're not, I feel like as long as your hobby isn't setting cans of petrol on fire or something like that, then the difference you make as an individual person is relatively small. And as long as super rich people are flying around on private jets and private yachts, then what you do will not make such a big difference. I still think we should all try, and I still will buy less yarn, like also because of that reason. But, and I don't use acrylics for that reason, but I feel like if your one hobby is knitting, and if your other hobby is collecting yarn, and it makes you happy to have that collection of yarn, please be happy. Like we all judge ourselves way too harshly, I think. I also think there's quite a lot of envy in the knitting community, and if people have like a lot of expensive yarns, I felt that. I feel a bit envious. People have this like quivered, I don't know how you pronounce it, but this really expensive fibre. I've wanted to touch it for so long to know what it feels like. It's supposed to be softer than cashmere, and I've never had it because I cannot justify this at all. But if I see people make a sweater from it, I do get a bit envious for sure. And I think that's part of it as well. And I also think that some of it is genuine worry. Like, I think the knitting community can be quite a genuinely warm place. And I've seen people remortgage their house to buy yarn. And at that point, I'm concerned. I will not comment, I will not say anything, but I don't think it's healthy. And other people are more vocal about that. And I think that's also part of it. But all of that together, I feel like we end up with a situation where if we buy a bunch of yarn, we judge ourselves, and we know we are judged if we kind of post about it and things like that. And that's a little bit complicated. I'm not saying it's outright wrong or anything, but I think that definitely all plays into it as well. And where am I going with all of this? I think in the end, I decided I would kind of try to see my yarn as less morally charged in either direction, because I think I was putting too much emotion into it and it was hindering my creativity. And I'm trying to see it more again like a palette full of colors where I can pick from and make something out of. And I'm really excited about taking you along on what I'm making at the moment in my next video. I hope I can manage to upload really soon, because there are a few things that I am really excited about now, which is weird because it's summer and it's really hot. So actually it's not the best knitting weather, but I will show you what I'm making super soon. I hope you found this helpful in some way. I'm really curious about your thoughts, so if you want to comment below, I'll be really happy to read your comments, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye!